The conference room door slammed shut behind me, and through the glass walls, I watched my colleagues settle into their seats around the polished mahogany table. The Innovation Summit planning meeting, the one I'd been mysteriously uninvited from after 3 years of leading Synteca's most groundbreaking projects. I'm Laura James, and until last week, I was Synteca's lead innovation strategist. 15 patents under my belt, 2 industry awards, and a track record that spoke louder than any resume ever could. I joined Syntec 12 years ago when it was still a scrappy startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Austin. Back then, innovation meant rolling up your sleeves and building something that worked, not presenting PowerPoints about disruption to venture capitalists. But apparently, that wasn't enough for our new CEO, Michael Torres, who'd swept in 6 months ago with his Stanford MBA, his collection of leadership books, and his corporate restructuring plans that read like a consulting firm's template. At 34, he was younger than some of the products I'd helped bring to market. "We're bringing in fresher ideas," he'd said during our brief hallway encounter yesterday, not even bothering to look up from his phone as he scrolled through what looked like LinkedIn profiles. "The summit needs voices that resonate with our evolving market demographic." You understand. I understood perfectly. In Torres's world, evolving market demographic was code for people who look like the investors we're trying to impress. And at 47, with gray streaks in my hair that I'd stopped dyeing months ago and a wardrobe that prioritized functionality over fashion trends, I apparently didn't fit that demographic. I didn't argue. I never do. That's been my mistake for the past decade, thinking my work would speak for itself, that results would matter more than appearances, that innovation would be valued over presentation skills. Walking back to my lab that afternoon, I passed the HR department where Stephanie Mills sat behind her desk, frantically typing away while simultaneously fielding calls from what sounded like recruitment agencies. She'd been avoiding my calls for weeks, ever since I'd submitted that formal complaint about the pattern of exclusion I'd been experiencing. Women over 40, it seemed, were becoming an endangered species in Torres's version of innovation. The evidence was impossible to ignore. In the past 6 months, 5 senior female engineers had been transferred to advisory roles or encouraged to take early retirement packages. Meanwhile, the company had hired 12 new innovation associates, all under 30, all with impressive social media presences, all eager to implement the latest business school theories about agile development and customer-centric design thinking. "Stephanie," I called out, stepping into her office. She looked up with that practiced corporate smile, the one she'd probably perfected during her HR certification courses. "Oh, Laura. How are you settling into your new, focused role?" Focused role. That's what they were calling it when they stripped away my team of 8 researchers and moved me to the basement lab that smelled like old concrete and industrial cleaners. The same basement where they'd relocated Agnes Chen from accounting and Frank Morrison from quality control, all of us experienced professionals suddenly finding ourselves in what felt like corporate exile. I wanted to follow up on my complaint. "It's been 6 weeks. These things take time to investigate properly," she said, already looking back at her screen where I could see an email draft about cultural transformation initiatives. "We want to be thorough. Due process, you understand." Thorough. Right. Like the thorough investigation into why my project budgets had been slashed by 60% while the young hotshots upstairs got blank checks for their disruptive thinking workshops and team-building retreats at expensive resorts. Like the thorough review of why my meeting invitations had started getting mysteriously delayed or cancelled while parallel planning sessions happened without me. But here's what Torres and his fresh-faced brigade didn't know: I'd been working on something that would change everything. Not just another incremental improvement or flashy presentation deck, real innovation that could revolutionize how we approached sustainable technology. For months, I'd been developing a prototype in secret. Project Aurora, a breakthrough in renewable energy storage that combined my expertise in materials science with advanced electromagnetic field manipulation. The technology could make traditional lithium-ion batteries obsolete by storing energy at the molecular level with 96% efficiency retention. I'd been documenting everything meticulously, refining the algorithms, hand-building components when the official supply requisitions kept getting denied or delayed. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they were upstairs planning their summit about the future of innovation, discussing paradigm shifts and blue sky thinking in conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, I was actually building that future with my own hands in a basement that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Every evening, after the building emptied and the security guards began their rounds, I stayed in my lab. The hum of servers mixed with the rhythmic beeping of diagnostic equipment, the soft blue glow of monitoring screens casting shadows on walls lined with technical specifications and half-finished prototypes from previous projects. This was where I belonged, not in some glass-walled conference room listening to 20-somethings regurgitate TED Talks about thinking outside the box while they'd never actually built a box, let alone thought outside one. My lab had become a sanctuary of real work. No buzzwords, no pivot strategies, no user journey mapping sessions. Just the pure satisfaction of watching theoretical concepts become tangible reality, of solving problems that actually mattered instead of creating solutions for problems that didn't exist. The Aurora prototype was elegant in its complexity, about the size of a desktop computer but containing technology that could power a small building for weeks on a single charge cycle. I'd solved the thermal management issues that had plagued similar attempts by other research teams. I'd cracked the stability problems that made energy storage at this level commercially viable for the first time. 2 days before the summit, something changed. I started noticing people I didn't recognize wandering the halls, men in expensive suits with visitor badges that said strategic consulting partners, asking pointed questions about our current projects, taking photos of equipment, requesting access to research databases. When I tried to access my usual technical repositories, I found my credentials had been downgraded to observer status. Suddenly, I couldn't pull the peer-reviewed papers I needed for the final Aurora calibrations, couldn't access the patent databases that helped me verify my innovations weren't duplicating existing work. That evening, I overheard a conversation in the elevator shaft that made my blood run cold. 2 of Torres's new hires were discussing the summit presentations, and I caught fragments about leveraging existing IP assets and repositioning dormant research projects under new leadership. That's when I realized what was happening. They weren't just excluding me from the summit, they were systematically preparing to claim credit for any innovations that emerged from the company during my tenure. My innovations. Work I'd done before Torres even arrived, research I'd been developing while they were still figuring out where the coffee machine was located. I spent that night creating redundant backups of everything. Every schematic, every test result, every breakthrough moment I documented over the past 8 months. I encrypted the files, stored copies on personal drives, even printed hard copies of the most critical documentation. I'd learned from watching other senior employees get pushed out, your work belonged to the company, but they could easily make you disappear from the narrative of its creation. The next morning, I arrived early to find my lab access card no longer worked on the main elevator. I had to use the freight elevator and enter through the service corridor, another subtle message that I was no longer considered part of the core operation. But they'd underestimated something crucial. I knew this building better than anyone. I'd been here when the basement labs were first installed, had helped design the power distribution system that made high-energy research possible. I had keys they'd forgotten about, access routes they didn't know existed, backup power supplies I'd installed myself during late-night projects years before Torres ever walked through the front door. 3 days after the summit began, I was in my lab running final diagnostic sequences on Aurora when the elevator dinged upstairs. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, growing louder as they approached my sanctuary. I recognized Torres's gait, quick, impatient, the walk of someone who'd never learned to slow down and observe before reacting. Torres burst through my lab door like a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, his face flushed red, tie askew like he'd been running through the building. Behind him trailed 2 executives I recognized from the summit promotional materials, Janet Sullivan from Meridian Ventures and William Hayes from Innovation Capital, both external investors whose checkbooks could make or break Synteca's next funding round. "Why are they pitching your prototype?" Torres shouted, waving his tablet in my direction with such force I thought he might throw it. I looked up from my workstation, where Aurora's main display showed perfect energy conversion rates, 96.3% efficiency over a sustained 12-hour cycle, numbers that would make MIT's energy lab weep with envy. The prototype hummed quietly on the workbench beside me, its sleek titanium housing warm to the touch, internal processes running smoothly after months of careful refinement. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you referring to?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "The Aurora project." "How did they get Aurora?" His voice cracked with panic, and I could see perspiration beading on his forehead despite the basement's perpetual chill. That's when it clicked into perfect, ironic focus. The young innovators upstairs, the ones with their fresh ideas and market-resonant voices and their carefully curated Instagram feeds about entrepreneurship, had somehow gotten hold of my preliminary research files. Maybe through old server backups they'd found during their digital asset inventory. Maybe through conversations they'd overheard during those late nights when I thought I was working alone. Maybe through one of my former team members who'd been reassigned to their projects and still had access to shared folders from before the reorganization. But here's what they didn't understand about real innovation: having data isn't the same as understanding the underlying science. They tried to present my concept to the investors, but they couldn't explain why the electromagnetic field configuration had to be precisely calibrated to avoid thermal cascade failures. They couldn't answer questions about scalability because they'd never actually built anything that worked. They couldn't demonstrate the prototype because they didn't actually have one. They had PowerPoint slides with theoretical projections and a lot of confident rhetoric about market disruption. How did you get Aurora? I asked, standing slowly. The team. Your old team members, they're presenting it as their breakthrough innovation. I almost laughed. My old team consisted of junior researchers who'd been reassigned to other projects months ago. They might have had access to my early research notes, but they'd never seen the real breakthrough, the actual working prototype standing right here in my lab. Mr. Torres, I said calmly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I gestured to the Aurora prototype, sleek, humming with quiet energy, displaying real-time data that proved everything I'd theorized was not only possible but actually working. This is Aurora. The actual Aurora. What your fresh innovators are presenting upstairs appears to be incomplete. One of the investors stepped forward, studying the display readings. This is extraordinary. The energy conversion rates, the storage capacity, this is exactly what we've been looking for. Torres looked between me and the prototype, his corporate confidence crumbling. But you're not part of the summit team. No, I said, meeting his gaze directly. I wasn't invited to be part of the summit team. Because apparently, 15 years of successful innovation doesn't qualify as fresh thinking. Janet Sullivan was already taking detailed photos of my lab setup with her phone, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement venture capitalists get when they smell genuine disruption. Ms. James, is it? How long have you been developing this technology? 8 months of intensive development on the working prototype, but the foundational research goes back 3 years. The theoretical framework actually originated from my doctoral thesis work 15 years ago. And you did this work, where exactly within the company structure? William Hayes asked, pulling out a leather notebook and expensive pen. I gestured around my basement lab, the cramped space with flickering fluorescent lights, cobwebbed corners, and equipment I'd salvaged from other decommissioned projects. Right here. In the space I was moved to when the company decided my experience wasn't compatible with their innovation strategy. Hayes wrote something down quickly. What kind of budget allocation did you receive for this research? Torres shifted uncomfortably. This was clearly not the direction he'd expected this conversation to take. Initially, I had a standard R&D budget of $200,000 annually. Over the past 6 months, that was reduced to $15,000. Most of the components for Aurora were built using salvaged parts from previous projects or purchased with my own funds. Your own funds? Sullivan looked incredulous. You self-funded breakthrough research? When you believe in something strongly enough, you find a way to make it work, I said, running my hand along Aurora's smooth surface. Innovation doesn't wait for budget approval. Torres's panic was shifting to defensive anger, the kind that happens when someone realizes their carefully constructed narrative is falling apart in real time. You should have disclosed this project through proper channels. There are protocols, reporting structures. Like the protocols I followed when I submitted my innovation proposal 6 months ago? The ones that got buried in committee reviews that never seemed to conclude? I pulled out a thick folder from my desk drawer, months of printed emails, proposal drafts, meeting requests, and budget justifications. Were the protocols I followed when I filed concerns about systematic exclusion of senior staff from strategic planning? I opened the folder and spread documents across my workbench. Here's my proposal for expanded energy storage research, submitted in January, no response. Here's my request to attend the Clean Energy Summit in Denver, where I could have connected with potential collaboration partners, denied due to budget constraints. Here's my application to lead a cross-functional innovation team, redirected to await organizational restructuring. Hayes was reading over my shoulder, his expression growing more interested by the minute. These proposals look comprehensive. The technical specifications are exactly what we discussed during our market analysis sessions. Torres looked like he might be sick. That's different, the company was transitioning to new management structures. Is it different? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the company systematically excluded its most experienced innovator from innovation planning, then acted surprised when real innovation continued to happen despite their efforts to shut it down. Sullivan had moved to Aurora and was studying the diagnostic readouts. This energy conversion rate, is this sustainable over extended periods? I've run continuous operations for 72 hours with no performance degradation. The longest test cycle was 2 weeks, during which efficiency actually improved by 0.3% as the system optimized its internal processes. 2 weeks? Torres looked stunned. You've been running this for 2 weeks? The power consumption alone would have been noticed if anyone had been paying attention to this floor, I finished. But since I'd been effectively invisible for months, no one bothered to check what was happening down here. The investors exchanged glances. One of them spoke up, "Mr. Torres, we're going to need to discuss this development privately." After they left, Torres remained in my lab, looking deflated. "Why didn't you tell me about this project?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. I tried. Multiple times. But every proposal I submitted got lost in review processes. Every meeting I requested got postponed indefinitely. Every time I attempted to present new concepts, I was told the company was moving in a different direction. We weren't trying to exclude you personally. Weren't you? When you restructured the innovation team, every person over 45 was either moved to advisory roles or transferred to maintenance projects. When budget allocations were discussed, senior researchers were consistently overlooked in favor of emerging talent. When the summit was planned, experience was dismissed as incompatible with fresh thinking. I continued, my voice growing stronger. This isn't just about me, Mr. Torres. This is about a company that decided experience was a liability instead of an asset. You brought in consultants to teach innovation to the same people who've been innovating successfully for decades. You created a culture where being older automatically means being out of touch. We needed new energy. You had new energy. You had experience too. But you chose to treat them as mutually exclusive instead of complementary. I pulled up my documentation on the computer screen. Aurora exists because I have 15 years of failures to learn from. I know which approaches don't work because I've tried them. I understand the market because I've watched it evolve. I can solve complex technical problems because I've been solving them long enough to recognize patterns. Over the following weeks, the aftermath of that confrontation rippled through Syntech in ways none of us could have anticipated. The investors were fascinated by Aurora, but they were even more interested in the story behind it. How had the company's most promising innovation been developed in isolation by an excluded team member? What did that say about Syntech's innovation management processes? More importantly, what other breakthrough research might be happening in overlooked corners of the organization? Within days, Sullivan and Hayes had conducted interviews with Agnes from accounting, Frank from quality control, and 3 other senior employees who'd been sidelined during the restructuring. They discovered a pattern that went far beyond my individual case. Experienced professionals throughout the company had been systematically devalued while their institutional knowledge was being overlooked in favor of flashier, less substantial initiatives. The investors requested a full audit of Syntech's innovation pipeline, and what they found was sobering. The fresh thinking teams had produced dozens of theoretical frameworks and presentation decks, but 0 working prototypes. Meanwhile, the displaced senior staff had continued developing practical solutions to real problems, often using their own time and resources. Stephanie from HR finally called me back, her tone dramatically different from our previous conversations. Suddenly, my complaint wasn't just a priority, it was the center of a company-wide review of management practices. There were forms to fill out, depositions to give, external consultants brought in to investigate what the investors were now calling systemic leadership failures. Torres found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to the board of directors why he'd marginalized the company's most productive researcher while promoting teams that had produced no measurable results. The summit he'd been so proud of, the one showcasing Syntech's commitment to innovation, had become an embarrassment when investors realized the actual innovation was happening despite, not because of, company leadership. But the real change came from something unexpected. Other companies started calling me. Word had gotten out about Aurora and the circumstances of its development. Industry publications picked up the story. The innovation they tried to ignore became a case study in business schools about the dangers of age discrimination in technical fields. I found myself with options I hadn't had in years. Offers from competitors, consulting opportunities, speaking engagements about fostering inclusive innovation cultures. For the first time in months, I felt like my voice mattered. But more importantly, I realized something about myself. I'd been waiting for permission to innovate when I should have been innovating regardless of permission. 6 months later, I'm still at Syntech, but everything has changed. I lead a new cross-generational innovation team that combines experience with fresh perspectives. Aurora is moving toward commercial production, with 3 major tech companies competing for licensing rights. The Summit team? They're part of my broader project group now, learning that real innovation requires both vision and the technical depth to make vision reality. Torres and I have developed a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than demographic assumptions. He's learned that fresh ideas come from fresh thinking, not necessarily from fresh faces. And Stephanie? She's implemented new HR protocols for handling discrimination complaints. Apparently, 6-week delays are no longer considered thorough investigation practices. Here's what I want you to understand: your experience isn't obsolescence, it's expertise. Your years of work aren't a liability, they're a competitive advantage. When organizations tell you they need fresh thinking, remind them that the freshest thinking often comes from combining new ideas with deep understanding. Don't wait for permission to innovate. Don't let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter because of your age, your experience, or your unwillingness to conform to someone else's idea of what innovation looks like. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to be revolutionary according to someone else's definition. Your prototype is waiting. Build it.